The night in ancient Egypt was unlike any other. As the sun slipped beneath the horizon, painting the sky in hues of burning gold and soft indigo, the Nile reflected a fragile, trembling light that shimmered across its surface. Shadows stretched long and ominous, draping over the massive stone columns of temples and the narrow streets of villages. What appeared calm and serene by day transformed into a world of whispers, of secrets best left untouched. The people who walked these streets after dark were not the same ones seen at sunrise. These were individuals who moved between the realms of the known and the forbidden, guided by curiosity, devotion, or desire. They were drawn by rituals that the daylight forbade, practices whispered about but never openly discussed, feared even by the most learned priests. From the distance came the faint echo of drums, slow and deliberate, carrying a rhythm older than any living memory. The sound seemed to crawl along the edges of the city, snaking through alleyways and over sand-swept courtyards. Those who heard it knew to hush their steps, to avoid the gaze of strangers who might be wandering with eyes that saw too much. At the heart of the city, where the river curved like a silver serpent, priests and acolytes prepared in hidden chambers, their movements precise, almost reverent. Incense burned thick in the air, curling around statues of gods whose faces glowed faintly under the flickering torchlight. Here, in these shadowed sanctuaries, the rules of daytime life did not apply. Here, the forbidden thrived. Yet even as the audience is drawn into this mysterious world, there is a disquieting sense that these nights were not without consequence. Stories whispered by commoners speak of people who disappeared without warning, their homes found abandoned, their belongings untouched, as if they had been swallowed by the darkness itself. Temples held records too sacred to read aloud, scrolls describing rituals so secretive that a single word spoken outside the chamber could bring divine wrath. Fear intertwined with fascination, devotion was inseparable from terror. Those who dared to participate in these rituals were both brave and foolish, guided by faith or ambition, or perhaps compelled by some inner obsession that the daytime could never satisfy. The air itself seemed charged with expectancy, as though the Nile held its breath, watching the events unfold in silence. A solitary figure might move along the riverbank, cloaked in the darkness, carrying offerings or performing rites known only to a select few. Another might slip into a temple, hands trembling as they touched the cold, carved stones, whispering words that had echoed across centuries. The city, so alive under the sun, became a landscape of tension and hidden purpose. Every shadow could conceal an ally or an adversary, every whisper could carry a warning or a temptation. There was no certainty, only the fragile line between what was permitted and what was forbidden. And yet, for all its danger and secrecy, there was a strange allure to the night. It promised knowledge, power, and the thrill of seeing beyond the mundane. Those who experienced it carried the memory of it forever, their lives altered in subtle or dramatic ways. Some found themselves bound to secrets they could never reveal, while others fell victim to forces beyond their comprehension. As the moon rose higher, casting a pale silver glow over the temples and rooftops, the audience is left to imagine the possibilities. What occurred in those hidden chambers? Who walked in silence beneath the torchlight, and why? What knowledge or horror awaited those daring enough to seek it? In this world, there were no casual spectators. Every movement, every glance, every whispered word mattered. The night belonged to those who dared to enter its shadows, but it demanded a price. And as the first section closes, a lingering sense of unease remains. The audience is left questioning what line between devotion and danger, curiosity and obsession, had been crossed. What secrets, hidden under the cover of night for nearly 2 millennia, remain buried in the sands, waiting to be uncovered by those bold enough to peer into the darkness? The whispers began long before the city itself seemed alive at night. Tomb workers, scribes, and ordinary citizens told stories of shadows moving where no light should fall, of voices chanting in corridors that led to nowhere. These were not idle tales meant to scare children, they were reports born of fear and experience, repeated in hushed tones over generations. Each whispered story hinted at rituals that defied the laws of both men and gods, acts performed by those sworn to serve divine order. There were rumors of secret passages beneath temples, hidden chambers in palaces, and narrow stairways carved into the cliffs along the Nile, all leading to spaces where the normal rules of civilization seemed to dissolve. The priests, the guardians of knowledge, were both revered and feared. They carried themselves with solemnity by day, guiding worshippers through ceremonies bathed in sunlight, their hands steady and their voices calm. Yet behind closed doors, at the time when the city slept, these same men became custodians of a world so strange, so forbidden, that even their own acolytes sometimes hesitated to enter. Some spoke of texts inked on brittle papyrus, written in codes meant to protect secrets too dangerous to be revealed. These writings described rites that invoked powers both celestial and terrifying, prayers that could summon favor or calamity in equal measure. For those who dared read even a single line, the temptation to experiment with the unknown was irresistible, but the price could be fatal. Among the tomb workers, tales were particularly vivid. They spoke of nights when the air seemed to hum with energy, when shadows cast by the torchlight elongated and twisted in unnatural ways. Some claimed to have seen figures moving with unnatural speed, disappearing into walls or reappearing in the flicker of an instant. Others spoke of soft chants that echoed off the stone with such clarity it felt as though the very gods themselves were listening. One worker, whose name has been lost to history, supposedly witnessed a ritual in which a priest entered a tomb and emerged hours later changed, his eyes darkened, his movements jerky and unearthly, as though he had touched a realm far beyond human comprehension. No one knew whether this transformation was divine blessing, madness, or a curse, but it left a permanent mark on those who witnessed it. Even those outside the temple felt the effects of these secret rites. Merchants returning from late markets would sometimes glimpse flickering torches in courtyards that should have been empty. Children swore they heard footsteps in alleyways, footsteps that slowed when approached and vanished when chased. Families noticed the inexplicable disappearance of livestock, sudden illnesses, and strange, fleeting shadows that lingered at the corners of rooms. The city seemed alive with mystery, a place where danger and devotion coexisted in uneasy balance. Fear was never far from fascination, and curiosity often led those brave enough to trespass into realms they could neither understand nor escape. The rituals themselves were said to be meticulous and elaborate, a combination of strict protocol and esoteric symbolism. Offerings were prepared with obsessive care, chants memorized and recited precisely, gestures executed in perfect sequence. One misstep could invoke wrath rather than blessing, and many priests recounted instances of punishment so severe it would terrify a modern audience. Some reports spoke of temporary madness, others of permanent disappearance, and a few of deaths that could not be explained through natural causes. The stakes were not merely ceremonial, they were existential, a reminder that the night demanded both reverence and caution. Yet despite the danger, human nature thrived on transgression. There were always those who could not resist, whose desire to glimpse hidden truths overrode fear. A scribe might sneak into the inner sanctum to copy forbidden texts. A merchant's son might hide behind pillars, watching in awe as cloaked figures moved in intricate patterns around a stone altar. And always, there were whispers of consequences. Those who crossed certain boundaries never returned in the same way. Some became obsessed with what they had seen, haunted by visions and dreams that seemed more real than waking life. Others were consumed entirely, leaving nothing behind but a name, a memory, and a warning carved into the minds of those who remained. The allure of forbidden knowledge was not limited to priests and workers. Even rulers, whose authority seemed absolute by day, could not resist the pull of what occurred under the cover of darkness. Secret chambers within palaces held ceremonies meant to curry favor with gods in ways too dangerous to announce publicly. Advisors and courtiers spoke in coded language, careful never to disclose what they had seen, yet unable to suppress the thrill of power obtained through knowledge that others could not touch. And in these moments, when the hierarchy of life was temporarily suspended, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would falter and who would master the night. By the end of the section, the tension reaches a quiet crescendo. The audience has seen glimpses of human ambition, fear, and obsession, all intertwined with rituals that defied understanding. Questions linger: who truly controlled the night? Were the participants guided by faith, madness, or something else entirely? What were the costs for those who dared to transgress? As the camera pans over moonlit rooftops and silent courtyards, the whispers continue, a haunting echo of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud, setting the stage for a deeper exploration of the city itself and the shadowy figures who shaped its hidden life. As night deepened, the city itself seemed to transform into something almost unrecognizable, a living organism whose pulse beat only when the sun had fled. By day, the streets of Thebes, or perhaps Alexandria, bustled with commerce, devotion, and casual human interaction. Merchants haggled over spices, fishermen hauled their catch from the river, children ran between mud-brick homes laughing in the warmth of the sun. But as darkness fell, a different reality emerged. Shadows thickened and stretched unnaturally over the narrow alleyways and sandstone walls. The city became a theater of secret movement, where unseen actors enacted rituals, bargains, and betrayals that could determine the fate of families, dynasties, and even the gods themselves. It was in this shadowed city that the duality of life became most apparent. By day, order and tradition governed every action. Temples stood as monuments to divine authority, their courtyards filled with chanting priests and orderly worshippers. But by night, the rules seemed suspended, replaced by a clandestine code known only to a select few. Markets and homes that appeared deserted could conceal furtive exchanges, secret meetings, and preparations for rites whose significance would confound anyone not initiated into the mysteries. Ordinary citizens occasionally glimpsed cloaked figures moving silently across rooftops or through courtyards, leaving behind only the faint smell of incense or the whisper of footsteps fading into stone. Among these nocturnal figures, some were ordinary people drawn into the web of secrecy by necessity or curiosity. A merchant delivering goods under the cover of night might find himself inadvertently witnessing a ritual, his presence both dangerous and revealing. Children, too young to understand the dangers, would sometimes follow shadows into alleyways, only to be startled by chants that seemed older than memory itself. Even the city guards, vigilant by day, were ill-equipped to confront what happened in the darkness. Rumors of disappearances, spectral figures, and strange phenomena circulated among them, leaving the audience to question whether these events were mere superstition, or if something far more sinister thrived in the night. The architectural layout of the city contributed to its shadowed life. Narrow passageways funneled torchlight in eerie patterns, reflecting off stone walls to create illusions that made the familiar seem alien. Rooftops offered vantage points for those who wished to observe or evade, while hidden staircases and subterranean tunnels provided access to chambers and sanctuaries known only to the initiated. The city was a labyrinth not just of stone, but of secrecy, where every corner could conceal a witness or a trap. Those who moved with confidence through its darkness did so because they understood its rhythms, its silent warnings, and its hidden rules. The rest, untrained and unaware, risked becoming lost in a world that did not forgive mistakes. It was also during these hours that power and danger intersected most clearly. Certain high-ranking individuals, previously seen only in ceremonial splendor by day, now moved with discretion and calculation. Courtiers and minor officials would scurry along hidden corridors, carrying messages or offerings meant for eyes unseen. Here, political intrigue entwined with religious devotion, creating a tension that was palpable even to the most cautious observer. Secrets were currency, knowledge was leverage, and the line between loyalty and treachery blurred in the flickering torchlight. Some of these figures would later claim divine guidance for their actions, but whether this was piety or pretense remained a question suspended in shadow. Among the nocturnal life of the city were also those who served darker purposes. Assassins, spies, and thieves found opportunity in the ambiguity of night. They moved with ease where ordinary citizens would hesitate, exploiting the unseen corners and shifting shadows for their gain. Their presence created an atmosphere of constant unease, where trust became scarce and every encounter might carry hidden consequences. A misplaced glance or a misinterpreted gesture could unravel years of planning or ignite conflicts with deadly outcomes. The city itself, with its maze-like structure and hidden alcoves, became both protector and accomplice, enabling secretive acts that might have been impossible in daylight. Even within the hidden chambers and secret rooftops, human emotion played a central role. Some participants approached their nocturnal activities with devotion and reverence, hoping to commune with the divine or understand truths forbidden to the uninitiated. Others were motivated by fear, compelled to obey rituals whose significance they barely comprehended. And then there were those driven by ambition, willing to navigate perilous customs to gain advantage, power, or forbidden knowledge. In each case, the city became a stage where human ambition, curiosity, and fear intersected with mystery and ritual, creating a tension that seemed to hum in the air itself. By the end of the night, the city was far from silent. Even as the first pale hints of dawn began to brush the horizon, lingering shadows clung to walls and rooftops, remnants of the deeds and decisions made under cover of darkness. Observers, whether hidden or participating, carried with them the weight of secrets too powerful or dangerous to speak aloud. The duality of the city, the world of order by day, the hidden theater of transgression by night, left an indelible impression on those who witnessed it, and a lingering question for the audience: who truly held power in this shadowed world? Was it the priests, the rulers, the initiates, or the unseen forces that seemed to guide them all? As the camera metaphorically pans over the moonlit Nile, reflecting light onto the silent stone of the city, the audience is left with a sense of uneasy anticipation. The shadowed city has revealed its pulse, its hidden life, and its silent actors. Yet, what lies deeper, beneath the rooftops, within the hidden chambers, or in the hearts of those who dared walk its streets at night, remains a mystery. The night has only begun to reveal its secrets, and the journey deeper into forbidden rites and clandestine power is about to escalate, drawing the audience further into a world both familiar and terrifyingly unknown. The true guardians of the night were not the shadowed streets, nor the hidden alleyways, but the men and women sworn to protect the divine knowledge that the world above feared to understand. Priests, scribes, and ritual attendants moved with a precision born of years of training, their every action a delicate balance between devotion and fear. By day, they performed their duties with ceremonial calm, guiding worshippers, offering prayers, and tending to the sacred texts. But by night, the veneer of order cracked, revealing a complexity that was far more human, and far more dangerous, than the bright, orderly world would allow. These were men and women who bore the weight of secrets so potent that a single misstep could invoke not just punishment, but death. For the priests, loyalty was never a simple matter. They were caught between the dictates of divine law and the insatiable curiosity that haunted the human heart. Some, like the young acolyte whose name has been lost to history, entered the inner sanctums with trembling reverence, hoping to witness the sacred rites, only to find themselves overwhelmed by the intensity of the experience. Others, hardened by years of training and exposure, moved with a cold, calculating precision, suppressing fear with the discipline that only relentless ritual could instill. Yet beneath this practiced calm lay a human vulnerability, doubt, temptation, and the haunting question of whether their devotion was to the gods, or to the knowledge they coveted in secret. The scribes, too, played a vital role, serving as both recorders and interpreters of the esoteric knowledge that others dared not approach. Their hands, ink-stained and steady, copied sacred texts with meticulous care, preserving the instructions for ceremonies that had been handed down across generations. But the scrolls they guarded were more than mere words. They contained diagrams of rites that could summon protection, or destruction, drawn in a language that teetered between clarity and coded enigma. One mistake, one misread symbol, could unleash consequences the scribes could neither predict nor control. Some of these men became obsessed, poring over the texts night after night, their eyes burning with the desire to understand secrets that perhaps were never meant for mortal comprehension. Even within this disciplined structure, fear was never far from the surface. There were whispered accounts of acolytes vanishing during ceremonies, never to be seen again. Some claimed divine punishment, others feared darker forces at play, perhaps unleashed by the rituals themselves. Those who remained were left to wrestle with doubt and paranoia, questioning whether their companions had fallen victim to misfortune, betrayal, or some curse invoked in error. The priests themselves admitted that even the most devoted could be corrupted by the power these secrets offered. It was a perilous world, where knowledge was a weapon and devotion a fragile shield. Among the temple guards, tension manifested differently. Their duty was to protect both the physical temple and the sanctity of the rites, yet the nocturnal ceremonies often required discretion that went against their instincts. They learned to read the subtle signs of ritual, how to move silently without disturbing the sacred energy, when to speak and when to remain invisible. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon them, for they were not merely protecting property, they were safeguarding mysteries that had the potential to alter the balance between life and death. Mistakes were fatal, not only to themselves but to the entire hierarchy that depended on their vigilance. Yet human nature, even in these sacred spaces, was never entirely restrained. Desire, ambition, and fear intersected with devotion in unpredictable ways. Some priests were drawn to the allure of forbidden power, experimenting with rites in the shadows, believing themselves capable of controlling forces beyond comprehension. Others were motivated by fear of divine wrath, performing rituals meticulously to avoid catastrophe, even as doubt gnawed at their confidence. Among the scribes, some sought favor with high-ranking officials, manipulating the sacred knowledge to gain influence or protection. In every corner, the tension between obedience and self-interest created a fragile, combustible equilibrium. One recurring narrative among these guardians was the tale of a priest who disappeared during a particularly dangerous ritual. Witnesses claimed he had crossed the threshold into a chamber sealed for centuries, entering with ritual chants and offerings. Hours later, when the chamber was opened, the priest was gone. His robes were left neatly folded, his sandals in place, but he had vanished without a trace. Some claimed he had been consumed by the divine power he sought to command, others whispered of betrayal among the guardians, a calculated elimination to protect a secret too dangerous to survive exposure. The story spread through the temple like a warning, a shadow that lingered over every subsequent ceremony. Despite these dangers, the guardians carried on, bound by duty, fear, and a sense of destiny. Each night, they walked the narrow corridors and climbed the temple steps with hearts heavy with tension, yet minds focused on precision. They were fully aware that the line between life and death, obedience and transgression, was razor-thin. Every movement mattered. Every whispered word could alter outcomes. And in this charged atmosphere, alliances were fragile, suspicions constant, and loyalty tested to the limits of human endurance. By the close of this section, the audience has glimpsed the human stakes behind the forbidden rites, not merely the arcane symbols or the hidden chambers, but the lives, ambitions, fears, and obsessions of those entrusted to safeguard and participate in them. Each guardian, each scribe, each acolyte is a living testament to the tension between knowledge and mortality. And as the audience contemplates the high cost of these secrets, a new question emerges, poised to pull them deeper into the narrative: who among them will falter when the rituals intensify, and whose ambition or curiosity will push them beyond the point of no return? The city's nocturnal heartbeat grows louder, more urgent, and the stage is set for the dramatic unveiling of the forbidden nighttime rites that will change everything. While the city slept under the soft glow of the moon, far more than ritual unfolded in the shadows. The forbidden nighttime ceremonies were not simply acts of devotion or superstition, they were intertwined with power, politics, and the fragile hierarchies that governed life in ancient Egypt. Families and dynasties, though outwardly secure in their opulent palaces, were quietly manipulated by these secret rites, their fates often determined not by birthright but by who had access to the hidden knowledge of the night. The audience begins to see that power in this world was not absolute, it was conditional, contingent on secrecy, cunning, and sometimes sheer luck. Among the ruling elite, suspicion was a constant companion. High-ranking officials, advisors to the pharaoh, and members of influential families all knew of the rituals, but not all were trusted to witness them. Knowledge was dangerous, and in this delicate ecosystem, a single misstep could result in ruin, or death. Tales speak of advisors who, motivated by ambition or fear, used what they observed in secret chambers to manipulate rivals, turning one family against another or influencing decisions that would ripple across the city. The rituals themselves became instruments of strategy, their significance far beyond the spiritual or mystical, touching the very core of political control. The personal cost of such secrecy was immense. Families lived with constant tension, unable to speak openly about what they knew or suspected. Even in private chambers, whispers could be fatal, and loyalties were tested not just by ambition but by survival. Fathers, sons, and brothers were drawn into plots that required absolute discretion, their relationships strained by fear and the weight of secrets. In some accounts, the betrayal came not from enemies outside the family, but from within, a brother turning against brother, a trusted confidant revealing knowledge for favor or protection. The audience begins to understand that these rituals were as much about human psychology as divine worship. The darkness exposed not just mystical truths, but the raw ambitions and vulnerabilities of those who wielded it. One particularly chilling account involves a prominent family whose influence stretched across the city. The patriarch, known for his devotion to the gods, had secretly allowed his household access to certain rites, believing that divine favor would secure their power. But ambition, always lurking, proved more powerful than piety. One of his sons, eager to assert control, covertly observed the ceremonies and interpreted the omens to manipulate alliances. That night, subtle betrayals unfolded, servants were coerced, messages misdirected, and rivals quietly eliminated. By dawn, the family's structure had shifted irrevocably, the consequences of the night leaving scars that would last generations. The audience senses a cruel irony: knowledge intended to preserve life and order could just as easily sow destruction. The line between divine sanction and human treachery was often indistinguishable. Priests and scribes, who had once been considered impartial conduits to the gods, were sometimes complicit in schemes to elevate or eliminate certain families. Their roles as custodians of sacred knowledge granted them influence that could rival even the most powerful officials. Yet this power was a double-edged sword. A miscalculation could provoke both divine displeasure and mortal revenge. Some scribes recorded events in cryptic codes, preserving secrets that might one day be used to expose treachery, or protect the guilty. The very act of witnessing a ritual could be weaponized, turning faith into leverage, devotion into a dangerous form of espionage. The audience is drawn into the human element of these clandestine intrigues. Fear, ambition, and loyalty collide in ways that are at once relatable and horrifying. Characters are not mere archetypes, they are flesh and blood, motivated by love, greed, or desperation. One acolyte, who had entered the rites with reverence, became an unwilling witness to a carefully orchestrated betrayal that resulted in the disappearance of a noble family member. Another priest wrestled with conscience, torn between exposing a plot that violated both law and faith, and remaining silent to protect the sanctity of the temple. Each decision carried weight beyond the immediate moment, shaping the destinies of individuals, families, and entire communities. Sometimes, the night demanded payment in blood, either literal or metaphorical. Those who miscalculated, who acted out of hubris or impatience, often met grim fates. Disappearances, sudden illness, and even unexplained deaths were all attributed, at least in part, to the hidden power of the rituals. These consequences served as both warning and lesson, reinforcing the precarious balance between ambition and reverence, secrecy and survival. And yet, for all the danger, the lure of influence and knowledge proved irresistible to some. Ambition, like a shadow itself, thrived in the darkness, feeding on curiosity, fear, and the human desire for control. By the end of the night, the city was left with its quiet tension intact, but the ripple effects of the evening's machinations were already beginning to unfold. Alliances had shifted, power structures subtly altered, and whispers of betrayal traveled through hidden channels, carried by those who had survived and understood the stakes. For the audience, the realization is chilling: the forbidden rites of the night were not just mystical practices, they were instruments of manipulation, capable of shaping history in ways far more profound than any public ceremony. The line between sacred duty and political strategy had blurred completely, leaving the human costs stark and undeniable. And yet, the night also held moments of reflection and subtle beauty. Some families, despite betrayal and ambition, continued to honor the gods with quiet reverence, seeking protection and favor for those they loved. Others, having witnessed the darker outcomes of ambition and secrecy, found themselves forever changed, wary of the shadows and the unseen forces that governed their lives. It is in this tension between devotion and ambition, fear and desire, that the city's hidden world truly reveals itself. The audience senses both the danger and the allure, the horror and the fascination, as they are drawn further into the intricate web of power, secrecy, and human emotion. By the close of this section, the stage is set for the next descent into darkness. The forbidden rituals, once mere spectacles of mystery, have now been shown to carry consequences that reverberate through families and politics alike. Questions loom large: who will survive the collision of ambition and divine wrath? Who will falter under the weight of secrets? And what price must be paid when human desire intersects with powers beyond comprehension? The night is far from over, and the audience is left suspended on the edge of revelation, ready to follow the story into the next chapter of horror, obsession, and betrayal. The night was not merely a time for rest in ancient Egypt, it was a stage for power, manipulation, and secrecy. As the moon climbed over the gilded pyramids, the corridors of the pharaoh's palace, usually echoing with the soft shuffle of servants, whispered with a darker energy. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, and the faint flicker of torchlight revealed faces that seemed both familiar and unknowable. For centuries, the daytime world had been meticulously documented, the grandeur of temples, the splendor of processions, the meticulous records of grain and gold. But the night belonged to another order, one almost invisible to the official scribes and historians. It was a time when fear could be wielded as a weapon, and power could change hands without a single public announcement. Within this clandestine world, the pharaoh's most trusted officials exercised a subtle yet terrifying control. They monitored neighborhoods, manipulated rituals, and enforced rules that only existed once the sun had set. But not everyone was comfortable wielding such power. A palace maid, barely 17 and named Iset, had learned this truth the hard way. Her family had served the royal household for generations, and her life had been shaped by obedience and caution. Yet she had seen things no ordinary servant was meant to witness. From the shadows, she observed the secret tribunal that convened at midnight, a council of priests and advisors that dictated punishments and rewards beyond the reach of the law. The tribunal's sessions were brutal in their precision. Decisions were executed not with violence alone but with psychological control, creating an environment where fear became the currency of compliance. Those who questioned, even subtly, were marked. Iset's role was ostensibly menial, to carry messages, sweep corridors, and clean chambers. Yet her observant eyes and quiet presence made her an inadvertent chronicler of events meant to remain invisible. She began noticing coded signals, gestures exchanged in whispers, the subtle movement of officials' robes that revealed alliances and betrayals. It was during one such night that she witnessed a confrontation that would forever change her understanding of power. A high-ranking scribe, a man usually noted for his calm demeanor, was accused of undermining a sacred nighttime ritual. The tribunal had interpreted a minor mistake as an act of rebellion. Iset watched as priests circled him like predators, chanting in low, hypnotic tones that seemed to warp the air itself. The man's protests were drowned by ritual incantations, and when he attempted to appeal to the pharaoh's oversight, he was silenced by an unexpected arrival, a masked official whose authority exceeded even the council's. The message was clear. Not even the most respected servants or scribes were untouchable. Fear, however, was not the only tool in play. The tribunal also used intrigue and rumor, turning officials against one another. Alliances were fragile, easily broken by suspicion. Iset learned that power in the palace was maintained not just through visibility but through invisibility, through secrets so carefully guarded that even those who witnessed them could be discredited or erased. It was a calculated form of social engineering, one that ensured obedience while keeping the masses ignorant of the nightly machinations that shaped their world. One night, as Iset carried a tray of water to a secluded chamber, she noticed a strange pattern etched into a piece of linen hanging near a wall. The symbols were subtle, nearly imperceptible to the untrained eye, but they conveyed a story, the names of victims, the dates of forbidden rituals, and a warning about a night when the unseen winds would sweep through the city. She realized that someone had taken great care to preserve a record of events that the pharaoh's scribes intended to obliterate. The linen, delicate yet enduring, was like a voice whispering from the past, a fragment of truth that survived centuries of erasure. Curiosity and fear battled within her. The tribunal's grip was powerful, and discovery could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. Yet the embroidery spoke to her sense of justice and memory, hinting at the existence of a network that resisted the erasure of truth. It suggested that the pharaoh's edicts, though absolute in theory, were being challenged quietly, subtly, in the dark hours when the palace slept. She began to connect dots between minor anomalies, the missing lamps in certain chambers, the whispered warnings of fellow servants, the unusual patrol routes of the nightwatchers she had glimpsed years earlier. Each piece hinted at a larger conspiracy, one that could rewrite what anyone thought they knew about the night. The emotional stakes were not abstract. Iset felt the weight of potential catastrophe pressing on her young shoulders. Every night, she wondered if she would survive the next session of the tribunal, or whether the secrets she now carried would mark her for elimination. And yet, she could not turn away. The linen was more than fabric, it was a lifeline to truth, a thread that connected victims, perpetrators, and silent witnesses across the span of centuries. Its symbols were a puzzle, demanding interpretation, and she became obsessed with decoding them, fearing that failure would allow the tribunal's narrative to dominate history entirely. What made this darkness truly terrifying was how invisible it was. The pharaoh's daytime world continued as if untouched, while the night concealed layers of manipulation and cruelty. Power shifted silently among those who understood that control was most absolute when enforced in secrecy. Iset, a seemingly insignificant servant, now stood at the threshold of knowledge that could destabilize the carefully curated image of Egyptian society. She realized that the night was not just a temporal space, it was a weapon, a canvas for hidden agendas, and a trap for anyone who dared observe too closely. Her final discovery that night sealed the tension. Hidden beneath the floorboards of a storage chamber, she found a set of coded scrolls, detailing the tribunal's decisions, the names of disappeared individuals, and cryptic references to the night of the unseen winds. The scrolls were arranged meticulously, as if anticipating the day they might be uncovered. Iset knew immediately that these documents were forbidden, that their revelation could dismantle centuries of sanctioned history. And yet, the question that haunted her, and now haunts the audience, remained unanswered: who orchestrated the events of that fateful night, and how many lives were sacrificed in the shadow of a ritual no one dared explain. The night ended, but the story did not. Iset's silent witness to these secretive councils, her painstaking collection of evidence, and her coded embroidery would later form the only surviving testament to a night Egypt wanted everyone to forget. The palace slept, the torches died down, and the moon traced its slow arc across the sky, oblivious to the conspiracy unfolding beneath its cold light. But somewhere in the darkened corridors, a single pair of eyes remained vigilant, carrying secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. The last image lingers, a stitched linen with cryptic symbols, hinting at the horrors, manipulations, and unseen forces that had shaped Egyptian nights for centuries, leaving the audience with a chilling question: how much of history is really written in daylight, and how much thrives in the shadows? The night the winds rose over the Nile was unlike any the Egyptians had known. What began as a gentle breeze quickly became a creeping force, curling through alleys, rattling shutters, and rustling the palm fronds in unnatural rhythms. Ancient texts, sparse and fragmented, hint at a sandstorm of unparalleled intensity, combined with the heavy stench of Nile vapors, an event that transformed a city of light and life into a landscape of fear and confusion. Yet the scribes, tasked with recording history, spoke of it only obliquely, as if the night itself demanded silence. What truly happened that night had been hidden behind layers of deception, ritual, and terror. Archaeological evidence corroborates fragments of these accounts. Charred remains of lamps were discovered in what used to be residential quarters. The fine dust of silicate sands lay in deep drifts within abandoned streets, suggesting powerful gusts had reached places no one expected. Bones of small birds, likely used in secretive ceremonies, were scattered as if blown from shrines. Even more perplexing were clay shards etched with hurried messages, fragments of ritual prayers interrupted mid-incantation. They hinted that someone had anticipated disaster, or perhaps orchestrated it. At the heart of the city, within the palace, the elite and the scribes struggled to maintain control. For centuries, the House of Life had served as both repository of knowledge and instrument of social order. Only those deemed worthy could enter its inner sanctums, and even they were bound by strict codes. That night, however, these sanctums were breached, not violently, but subtly. Records were tampered with, lights strategically extinguished, and guards rerouted along paths that left key neighborhoods exposed. The actions of a single individual could have spelled disaster, but the scale suggested something more deliberate, coordination that implied a network, perhaps connected to the cults whispered about in earlier years. The first real chaos emerged as the wind swept through the city's residential sectors. Oil lamps flickered and died, plunging homes into darkness. The priestly guards, trained to protect against spiritual as well as physical threats, were caught off guard. People ran blindly, trampling pathways and overturning household shrines in frantic attempts to secure safety. Some accounts describe families kneeling in open courtyards, chanting prayers to unseen gods, while sand and smoke choked the air around them. The city's elite, hidden behind palace walls, could only watch through carefully positioned slits and guarded terraces, aware that the disaster could be weaponized for political gain. In the midst of the storm, the Night Watchers, the paramilitary force introduced months earlier, appeared in fragmented historical accounts. Their presence was erratic, patrols that should have been continuous were absent in some sectors while others were unnaturally reinforced. Records suggest a deliberate misdirection, creating pockets of chaos to disguise what was truly occurring in the temples and hidden chambers. It was here that a crucial revelation emerges: someone had intended for the city to fear the night itself, to associate darkness with catastrophe, and to ensure that obedience would never again be questioned. Iset, the palace maid who had begun decoding forbidden symbols, played a pivotal role that night, though history would almost entirely obscure her contribution. She had memorized patterns of guard rotations, lamp placements, and secret entries. When she realized that certain neighborhoods were at risk, she took small but meaningful actions, moving lamps to mark safe passageways, leaving messages coded into the lining of robes, and signaling to residents who might otherwise have been trapped in their homes. Her interventions, subtle and almost invisible, likely saved dozens of lives, though the scribes would later claim the survival was mere luck. Meanwhile, the cult known as the Dove Eaters executed their ritual with grim precision. Hidden in underground chambers and shadowed courtyards, they performed a sequence of rites involving birds, fire, and sound vibrations that historians have only recently begun to understand. It appears that these ceremonies, forbidden and suppressed for generations, were designed to manipulate public perception, creating fear, attributing supernatural significance to natural events, and reinforcing the idea that only sanctioned priests and officials could control the forces of night. For those outside the cult, the windstorm became a tangible proof of their power, a dark spectacle wrapped in spiritual authority. Amid the chaos, the scribe who had documented the forbidden rituals, the one Iset had once seen, made a desperate attempt to preserve evidence. He recorded names, dates, and sequences of the rituals on fragile papyrus, hoping that some fragment would survive. But he was intercepted. The scrolls he carried were partially burned, leaving only glimpses of what had occurred. These remnants, combined with Iset's embroidery and pottery shards, would later form the skeleton of our knowledge of that night. The scribe's failure and Iset's quiet heroism together illustrate the tension between secrecy, survival, and historical memory. By dawn, the city had shifted from chaos to eerie calm. The wind subsided, and the once raging Nile seemed indifferent to the turmoil it had endured. Streets were littered with debris, some homes had collapsed, and dozens had vanished without trace. Temple rituals resumed as if nothing had occurred, the elite performing ceremonies to appease gods whose wrath may have been nothing more than political theater. And yet, traces of the night's events remained: charred lamps, scattered bones, coated textiles, and fragmented scrolls. Each artifact whispered hints of what was hidden, an invisible thread tying the living to a secret history of darkness, manipulation, and survival. The most unsettling revelation, however, came later through careful reconstruction. Scholars examining the fragmentary evidence noted patterns that could not be explained by natural forces alone. Lamp shortages, deliberate misdirection of guards, and the precise timing of the cult's ritual indicated that the storm had been exploited, perhaps even engineered, to create maximum fear and disorientation. Someone, or some group, had orchestrated chaos under the guise of divine wrath. It was no longer simply a natural disaster, it was a calculated event, blending meteorology, human psychology, and spiritual terror. The city's survivors, including Iset, carried the burden of memory. The trauma was etched into their daily lives, influencing behavior, alliances, and even urban planning for years to come. Entire neighborhoods were rebuilt with narrow passageways, carefully positioned lamps, and guard posts calculated to minimize future vulnerability. But the psychological imprint ran deeper. The night had proven that unseen forces could determine fate. Obedience was no longer just expected, it was demanded, reinforced by terror that would echo through generations. And yet, the question remains haunting: who was responsible for orchestrating the events of that night? How many lives were lost, and how many more were manipulated into complicity? The surviving fragments, linen, pottery, charred scrolls, offer only tantalizing clues. They hint at a convergence of cult influence, palace intrigue, and perhaps even personal vendettas, but nothing definitive. The mystery endures, leaving both historians and the audience with an unsettling truth: history, especially the history of the night, is always incomplete, shaped by those with the power to erase it. As the sun finally rose over the Nile, casting its golden light on a city scarred yet resilient, the stage was set for the next chapter. The Night Watcher's influence, the cult's clandestine operations, and the pharaoh's political maneuvers all remained in shadow, waiting to emerge again. And somewhere in the layers of sand, ash, and memory, Iset's quiet heroism and the fragments she helped preserve whispered to the future, that even in darkness, truth could endure, though never fully revealed. The audience is left with the chilling question: if this much survived a single night, what other secrets, horrors, and manipulations of the forbidden nighttime still lie buried beneath Egypt, waiting to be uncovered? In the aftermath of the winds and chaos that had swept through the city, whispers began to circulate, carrying hints of a design behind the disaster. While the masses struggled to comprehend the night's events, a more discerning few recognized the fingerprints of deliberate sabotage. The lamp shortages, the misrouted guards, the sudden disappearance of critical warnings, it all pointed to orchestration rather than mere chance. And yet, the perpetrators remained invisible, their motives hidden behind layers of ritual, politics, and fear. The first clues emerged through the careful reconstruction of the palace's daily routines. The Night Watchers, normally tireless and predictable, had inexplicably abandoned several key sectors, leaving entire neighborhoods vulnerable. Patrols were doubled in areas that had no strategic significance, while elite quarters were unusually protected. It was as if someone had understood the city's heartbeat and manipulated it to induce maximum chaos. The question that gripped historians, and would grip the audience, was simple yet terrifying: who could wield such power over the very instruments of night? One likely suspect surfaced in the historical fragments: an ambitious temple administrator whose influence extended beyond the sacred halls into the streets themselves. Known for his cunning and ruthless pursuit of favor, he had access to both the Night Watchers and the House of Life. The administrator had long resented certain officials who controlled lucrative trade and ritual positions, and the night's events provided the perfect cover for an intricate scheme. By exploiting fear, he could eliminate rivals, consolidate power, and shape public perception, all while keeping his hands seemingly clean. Yet as the investigation deepens, a startling realization emerges: the administrator could not have acted alone. Evidence from Iset's embroidered records, combined with the charred fragments of papyrus preserved in hidden chambers, suggests a network of complicity. Priests, scribes, and even some nightwatchers had been co-opted, knowingly or unknowingly, into the sabotage. Rituals performed under the guise of devotion had been subtly altered, serving dual purposes: spiritual observance for the public and tactical advantage for the conspirators. The blurred lines between faith and manipulation reveal the terrifying sophistication of the scheme. The human element, as always, adds layers of complexity. Those drawn into the conspiracy were not all villains; many were coerced, believing they were performing sacred duties while unwittingly enabling destruction. Among them was a young priestess tasked with distributing lamps in the city. Trained to follow orders and uphold ritual purity, she obeyed without question, unaware that her actions, or inactions, would leave entire districts vulnerable. Her fear and confusion mirror the audience's growing realization: history is rarely a story of pure heroes and villains, but of ordinary people swept up in extraordinary circumstances. Meanwhile, the administrator's own maneuvers were methodical and coldly calculated. He had anticipated the natural sandstorm, positioning his allies to exploit every weakness, every lapse in the city's defenses. Communications had been sabotaged, preventing timely warnings. Sacred signals were manipulated so that some rituals were conducted at the wrong moment, creating further disorientation. Even the nightwatchers' patrol patterns were subtly altered, exploiting their sense of duty to mask the larger scheme. The city's disaster was, in many ways, a testament to human ingenuity used for control and terror. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Neighborhoods that had once thrived fell into despair, their inhabitants traumatized by the sudden destruction. Some families vanished entirely, their deaths unrecorded in official chronicles. The administrator's rivals were neutralized or discredited, leaving him free to ascend in influence. Yet despite his apparent victory, cracks began to form. A few witnesses, like Iset, had retained fragments of truth. Her embroidery, her knowledge of guard rotations, and the papyrus shards created a thread that connected the chaos to deliberate human intervention. The administrator's carefully orchestrated secrecy was not absolute. The narrative takes a darker turn when subtle evidence points to manipulation of sacred rituals themselves. Certain ceremonies had been intentionally misaligned, producing effects that appeared supernatural to the general populace. Birds used in the dove-eater's rites were released prematurely, sound vibrations were altered, and flame patterns in lamps were subtly shifted. Each adjustment amplified panic, reinforcing the illusion that the gods themselves were punishing the city. What was historically recorded as divine wrath was in reality a meticulously engineered spectacle, designed to consolidate power, silence dissent, and instill lasting fear. Yet the most unsettling revelation is the personal dimension of the sabotage. The administrator's ambition intersected with human vulnerability in ways that were terrifyingly intimate. Some victims were chosen not for their social standing but for personal vendettas, rivalries, or family grudges. One scribe, known for chronicling forbidden knowledge, disappeared entirely, leaving only fragments of burned manuscripts behind. Another official, accused of minor ritual infractions, was publicly punished, reinforcing obedience in those who might otherwise question authority. Every act of sabotage carried a dual purpose: controlling the population and settling private scores. By the end of the night, the city had been reshaped, not by the forces of nature alone, but by a complex web of human manipulation. What the public experienced as chaos was in truth the culmination of months, perhaps years, of careful planning. The administrator's ambition, the nightwatcher's complicity, and the subtle orchestration of ritual created an environment where fear became a tool, secrecy became power, and the line between natural disaster and engineered catastrophe disappeared entirely. And yet, even with all the evidence, one question loomed: who else had orchestrated events from the shadows, and what was the ultimate goal? The nightwatcher's earlier actions, the cult's rituals, and the administrator's interventions were pieces of a larger puzzle. There were hints of a broader conspiracy, one that might extend beyond palace walls and city streets, touching upon the very heart of Egyptian governance. The audience is left to wonder how many others had been silently complicit, and how many more victims were erased from memory entirely. As dawn broke, the city seemed to breathe again, the winds dying, and the sands settling into quiet drifts. Yet beneath the calm, the traces of human design lingered. Streets bore the marks of orchestrated disruption, temples preserved rituals that had been subtly manipulated, and a handful of witnesses, including Iset, carried fragments of the hidden truth. Their testimony, encoded in fabric, clay, and charred scrolls, became a fragile thread connecting the present to the forbidden night. For the audience, the cliffhanger is clear: the sabotage was not a single act but a tapestry of calculated moves, and the deeper conspiracies, those that orchestrated shadows and fear, were still waiting to be revealed. The story closes on an image both haunting and cinematic: the palace gates bathed in dawn light, the night watchers absent, the streets eerily quiet. Yet the memory of the night lingers, invisible but potent, a reminder that history can be manipulated with a single, deliberate act, and that the most terrifying disasters are often those engineered by human hands. What the audience realizes, with a shiver, is that the Forbidden Night was not just an event, it was a masterclass in control, manipulation, and the enduring power of secrecy, setting the stage for revelations yet to come. The Night Watcher had been a shadow among shadows, a figure whose duty required vigilance, silence, and unquestioning obedience. For years, he had patrolled the city after sundown, a guardian of order and enforcer of laws no one outside the palace could see. He walked streets that teemed with secrets, listening to whispered conversations, recording movements, and ensuring that the nocturnal world remained under the pharaoh's control. Yet the events of that fateful night, the winds, the chaos, the manipulated rituals, had left an indelible mark on him. The man who once believed in absolute duty now questioned everything he had been trained to uphold. In the quiet hours before dawn, he returned to a secluded chamber, one far from the palace's main corridors, where no one would interrupt him. Here, he laid out a series of pottery shards, each inscribed with a fragment of a confession he had been too afraid to voice aloud for decades. The shards were uneven, the handwriting shaky, yet the words told a story that had never been officially recorded. He wrote of coercion, of moral compromise, and of the night when he became an unwilling instrument in a scheme that had left entire neighborhoods vulnerable. He confessed to facilitating misdirected patrols, extinguishing lamps in critical locations, and allowing certain rituals to proceed unmonitored, not out of malice, but out of fear for his own life and that of his family. The network he had been part of was vast, stretching from temple administrators to cult adherents, and each participant had their role meticulously orchestrated. He revealed the inner workings of the sabotage, the deliberate timing of events, and the calculated manipulation of fear. Every misstep, every tragedy, had been guided by human hands, not divine wrath. Yet the Night Watcher's confession went further than logistics. He reflected on the moral cost of obedience. Each action he had taken, each street left unpatrolled, each lamp extinguished, had weighed heavily on his conscience. He had watched families scatter into the chaos, had seen children cry in fear as sand and smoke filled the air, and had observed deaths that could have been prevented. The weight of these memories was unbearable, and he turned to the shards as a means of unburdening himself, knowing that official scribes would never record such truths. The confession also revealed the political undercurrents that had guided the sabotage. The temple administrator had used the Night Watcher not only as an enforcer but as a scapegoat. The chaos created a vacuum of power, and the administrator positioned himself as indispensable, both to the pharaoh and to the public perception of divine order. The Night Watcher had come to understand that the cult, the elite, and even the seemingly sacred rituals were all tools in a calculated game. Fear had been weaponized to eliminate rivals, consolidate power, and obscure inconvenient truths. Amid the technical and political details, the Night Watcher's personal reflections offered a rare glimpse into the human toll of secrecy. He described the internal conflict that gnawed at him, the knowledge that obedience had saved some lives while condemning others. He had witnessed the disappearances of officials who had resisted manipulation, the silent erasure of records, and the subtle ways in which fear dictated the behavior of both the powerful and the powerless. His confession became not merely a record of actions but a meditation on morality, responsibility, and the price of survival in a city ruled by hidden hands. The final shard contained the most haunting revelation. The Night Watcher had intended to confess these truths publicly but was silenced before he could do so. The last lines, now lost to history, hinted at names, rituals, and a confrontation that could have exposed the entire conspiracy. It was clear that someone, perhaps the temple administrator or a higher-ranking official, had anticipated the risk of disclosure and acted preemptively. The shards, scattered and fragile, were the only surviving testament to what had been deliberately erased from memory. As he completed the confession, the Night Watcher reflected on Iset, the young maid who had also observed fragments of the truth. He recognized that her quiet acts of preservation, her embroidery, the hidden symbols, the knowledge she carried, were as vital as his own testimony. Together, though separated by class and circumstance, they had become guardians of forbidden knowledge, witnesses to a night designed to terrify, manipulate, and control. Yet even their efforts were incomplete, leaving gaps that would puzzle historians and enthrall anyone who later discovered the fragments. The tension of the confession is palpable. Each shard is a reminder that history is fragile, vulnerable to destruction, and shaped by the choices of a few. The Night Watcher's fear, guilt, and meticulous documentation create a slow-burn suspense. Readers and viewers understand that the truth has been pieced together from fragments, and that the final revelation may be just out of reach. The shards themselves, buried and partially destroyed, symbolize both the fragility and the resilience of memory, of secrets that refuse to remain hidden forever. The scene closes with an image of the Night Watcher placing the final shard among the others, his hands trembling, the torchlight casting elongated shadows across the walls. He leaves the chamber quietly, knowing that he may never speak these words again, and perhaps anticipating that the fragments will be discovered only centuries later. The moonlight falls across the pottery shards, illuminating a puzzle of guilt, fear, and human ambition. The audience is left suspended, caught between the shadows of past deeds and the lingering question, who ultimately silenced him, and what other secrets of that forbidden night remain buried beneath the sands of Egypt. By the time the sun rose over the Nile, the city had returned to a semblance of normalcy, yet the scars of the forbidden night remained invisible to the casual observer. Streets that had been chaotic and scarred by sand and debris were quickly swept clean, temples resumed their rituals, and the pharaoh's court resumed its usual rhythm. But the truth, carefully documented in fragments, embroidery, charred scrolls, and pottery shards, told a far darker story, a story of manipulation, fear, and deliberate erasure. It was a history the pharaoh wanted forgotten, a night that could destabilize the illusion of divine order if remembered accurately. The deliberate suppression of records was methodical. Scribes who had chronicled the chaos vanished or had their works destroyed, witnesses like the Night Watcher were silenced, their confessions hidden within fragile pottery fragments, and subtle acts of heroism, like those of Iset, were obscured by time. The city itself became complicit in forgetting, because what survived was not the full truth but a curated narrative that reinforced the power of the elite. The audience begins to understand that history, particularly the history of the night, is not merely what is recorded, but what is allowed to endure. The deliberate construction of memory extended beyond physical records. Oral traditions were carefully shaped, exaggerating divine intervention while minimizing human agency. Stories of supernatural wrath were emphasized in public ceremonies, while any hint of human orchestration was whispered only in secretive corners, passed down in obscured symbols and cryptic textiles. The pharaoh's administration understood that controlling the narrative of fear was as powerful as controlling the city itself. They weaponized memory, ensuring that the lessons of that night would persist, but in a distorted form that served the powerful rather than the victims. Yet fragments of truth survived, and it is these fragments that create the emotional resonance of the story. Iset's embroidery, the Night Watcher's shards, and the partially burned scrolls preserved glimpses of human suffering, courage, and moral conflict. These remnants allow us to piece together the humanity of those involved, the young priestess who obeyed without knowing she endangered others, the Night Watcher torn between duty and conscience, the temple administrator whose ambition led to destruction, and the countless ordinary citizens whose lives were upended. Their experiences humanize history, showing that the Forbidden Night was not a distant abstraction, but a lived reality, full of fear, moral complexity, and profound consequences. The threads of conspiracy, coercion, and survival intertwine, revealing that the Forbidden Night was not merely an isolated event but a turning point in the social and political landscape. Neighborhoods were redesigned to prevent future chaos, guard patrols were altered permanently, and rituals became more tightly regulated, ensuring obedience and reinforcing fear. The psychological imprint of that night endured, influencing generations and shaping the way Egyptians viewed darkness, authority, and the unseen. Fear became institutionalized, a tool wielded by those in power to maintain control long after the winds had died and the sand had settled. What makes this night particularly haunting is the extent to which it was manipulated by human hands. Natural forces, wind, sand, and the unpredictable behavior of the Nile, were only part of the story. The tragedy and chaos were amplified, orchestrated to consolidate power, punish rivals, and enforce compliance. It is a chilling reminder that history, even when it seems dictated by the natural order, is often shaped by ambition, secrecy, and fear. The Forbidden Night becomes a lens through which we can examine the interplay between human agency and perceived divine will, showing how one can masquerade as the other with devastating effect. Yet even with deliberate suppression, echoes of the night persisted. Symbols embroidered on textiles, charred lamp fragments, and hidden scrolls offered a thread connecting past to present. These remnants create both suspense and replay value for the audience, who realize that history is never complete, and that the full scope of events may never be known. The emotional payoff comes from understanding the human cost of secrecy, the lost lives, silenced voices, and moral compromises that underpin the carefully curated historical record. The Forbidden Night, though obscured, continues to speak to us through these fragments, demanding that we piece together what was deliberately hidden. As the scene closes, the audience is left with a reflection that resonates beyond the sands of Egypt, civilization's curate memory, selecting which events to glorify and which to erase. The pharaoh's administration chose to preserve an illusion of divine order while erasing the human suffering and manipulation that had shaped the night. Yet fragments survive, and with them, the truth lingers, fragile but undeniable. The Forbidden Night teaches that history is not simply a record of events, it is a tapestry woven from fear, ambition, courage, and the resilience of those who dared to witness. The final image is both haunting and cinematic. The Nile flows steadily under the rising sun, the city alive with daily activity, yet the shadows of the Forbidden Night linger beneath the surface. Lamps flicker, symbols remain hidden in plain sight, and fragments of parchment and embroidery whisper secrets of power, manipulation, and survival. The audience is left suspended, reflecting on how much of history is deliberately hidden, how much is reconstructed, and how the human heart, brave, cunning, fearful, or resilient, shapes the stories that endure. The Forbidden Night may have been silenced in official records, but through these fragments, it speaks across millennia, a testament to the cost of secrecy and the persistence of truth.